Portland has perhaps one of the largest park systems in the U.S. They say you put it in the ground here and it grows, and it's absolutely true. We have an abundance of water, which gives us an abundance of fantastic greenery and plant life. The idea for the garden actually goes back a few years earlier than that even. In 1959, Portland and Sapporo on the northern island of Hokkaido became sister cities. And the idea came at that time of creating a place where Portlanders and Oregonians could learn more about the people and the culture and the art of Japan. There was a significant population of Japanese here. They came for opportunities for their families, for their children. They came as farmers, they came as businessmen, going back to 100 years ago. And in fact, what we now know as Chinatown here in Portland was originally Japantown. The Japanese came and they settled in that area. During World War II, of course you're aware, the tragic situation in which the Japanese were put into internment camps. That was really a terrible moment in U.S. history. And during that time, much of their land was taken away, it was bought up, they were not allowed to return to it. So it really kind of decimated the Japanese population here for the next couple of generations in Portland. In the 1950s, in the late 1950s, there was still a lot of anti-Japan sentiment in Oregon and Portland, and in fact across the United States. Japan was our mortal enemy in World War II. What people remember about Japan was Pearl Harbor and what was done there. And so if we were going to become allies and friends, there had to be some healing that was going to happen. And so this entire garden was built around this concept of peace, of understanding each other better as people, because the better that we understand each other, the less likely we are to go to war with each other. And so that's how the healing began. In 1954, the first ship to come from Japan to enter the port of Portland was on a peace mission, and it came from Yokohama, Japan. And on that ship was a lantern. And we call it the Peace Lantern. It was a gift from the mayor of Yokohama and the people of Yokohama. And that was the first step in this new relationship between Japan and Portland. So that lantern, of course, there was no Japanese garden at the time. It first sat down on the riverfront for a couple of years where the public could enjoy it and see it as a symbol of a beginning of a conversation, of a different conversation with Japan. And then it was moved up to the Rose Garden for a couple of years. And then when the garden was opened here in 1967, it was brought into the Japanese garden for the grand opening. And through this garden, that the people of Portland began to understand the people of Japan better. Japanese gardens are built around the idea of peace and tranquility. And so within the design elements, that is certainly built in. So when you look around this garden, yes, we have flowering plants and some flowers from time to time, but actually the palette of most of the plant material in this garden is all about green and shades of green that create this feeling of peace and tranquility. The paths and the stones that you step on, they're so very carefully placed. Lots of winding paths, stepping stones that are not connected but that you have to carefully step on. All of these things require you to be mindful about where you're stepping and how you're walking. There aren't many straight lines in a Japanese garden. The idea is that everything is intended to slow you down. The more corners you have to turn, the more stones you have to step on, the more careful and mindful you have to be, and that helps to slow you down. Our entire garden, the Sand and Stone Garden, is designed around the Buddhist qualities of meditation, of peace, of tranquility, of I'm going to sit here in front of this garden for an hour and I'm just going to meditate and I'm going to think and absorb the beauty of what it is. The garden has absolutely achieved its goals over history, and I'll tell a story that demonstrates that. Our original garden director came in 1963 to begin building this garden. And it was a different time in Portland and in the US, and there was still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment here in Portland. He was a young Japanese man who came and lived on a trailer at the site of the garden while it was being built. And he would come home from time to time, and there would be groups of people protesting that he was living here and that he was building this garden. And they would spray paint on the side of his trailer, "Go Home Jap." And at one point he was even mugged and physically attacked by a group of protesters here. That gentleman, Mr. Kinya Hira, our first garden director, left Portland 3 years later and vowed he would never return to the city of Portland or to this garden because of the experience that he had had here. Some 45 years later, we reached out to all of the former garden directors, and we wanted to have a gathering of them here at the garden for the first time. And in fact, I approached Mr. Hira and asked him if he would come back, and he said no, because of the experience he had. So it took me a couple visits and some convincing and working with his family, and we finally able to convince him to come back. He came to Portland that first visit about 5 years ago, and he saw what this garden had grown into. But more importantly, he saw what this garden had become to this community, how the community had embraced it and made it its own, how we had 11,000 members and how we had hundreds of thousands of visitors, and how when we had a panel discussion of those garden directors, 1,000 people showed up to come and hear what he had to say about his experience here. And you know what happened? All of his wounds were healed because he saw that the wounds of this community and their feeling for Japan had completely changed over the course of the preceding 45 years. And he realized in that moment that in fact this garden had done what it was intended to do, that it had brought peace and understanding between the people of Portland and the people of Japan in a way that he had never even imagined could happen.